There are moments when the fragility of life reveals itself in ways that shatter our comfortable assumptions about tomorrow. When loss arrives with such devastating timing that it exposes the cruel randomness of tragedy. And when someone standing in front of us carrying unbearable grief reminds us that behind every smile and every crowd might be someone whose world has just collapsed. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who show up even when showing up feels impossible, who fulfill commitments even when their hearts are shattered, who stand upright when everything inside them wants to crumble. These are the moments that humble us, that force us to recognize that we never truly know what battles the people around us are fighting, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply continuing to breathe when the person who gave your life meaning is gone. If you believe in honoring those who suffer silently, in recognizing the strength it takes to function through devastating loss, and in supporting military families who sacrifice in ways most civilians cannot comprehend, hit that like button and subscribe for stories that remind us to treat everyone with compassion, because we never know what they might be enduring behind their carefully maintained composure. The Henderson family walked onto the Family Feud stage during Veterans Week looking like any other military family competing on the show, presenting the image of togetherness and strength that military families work so hard to maintain even during difficult times. Captain Sarah Henderson, United States Army, stood as team captain at 29 years old with the bearing of someone who had been trained to project confidence and capability regardless of circumstances. She was joined by her mother, Patricia, a woman in her early 50s who had raised a daughter in military service and understood what that service demanded from families. Next to Patricia stood Sarah's younger brother, Jason, age 24, who worked as an EMT and carried himself with the calm competence of someone accustomed to emergencies. Sarah's best friend from college, Michelle, completed the lineup alongside Sarah's father-in-law, Robert Henderson, a man in his 60s who had himself served in Vietnam and understood military life from decades of experience. The family presented a united front, smiling for the cameras, ready to compete, but something about their energy felt slightly off in ways that were difficult to articulate, a fragility beneath the strength, a brittleness beneath the smiles. Steve Harvey greeted the Henderson family with his characteristic warmth, immediately focusing on Sarah as the family representative and thanking her for her service as he always did with military personnel during Veterans Week. "Captain Henderson," Steve said with genuine respect, "thank you for your service to our country. Tell us a little about yourself. Where are you stationed and what do you do in the Army?" Sarah's response was professional and composed, stating that she was a logistics officer currently stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, that she had served for 7 years including one deployment to Afghanistan, and that she managed supply chain operations for her unit. Steve nodded appreciatively and was about to continue with his standard pre-game banter when he noticed something that made him pause. Sarah was wearing her wedding ring on a chain around her neck rather than on her finger, and Steve's instincts told him there was a story behind that choice. Before Steve could formulate a question about the ring, his attention was caught by something else unusual about the family composition. He looked at Robert Henderson, who had been introduced as Sarah's father-in-law, and asked the natural follow-up question. "So we have your father-in-law here, but not your husband. Is he deployed?" "Where is Captain Henderson's husband today?" The question hung in the air for just a moment too long, and Steve watched as every member of the Henderson family tensed simultaneously, their expressions shifting from game show excitement to something much more complex and painful. Sarah's professional composure wavered for just a fraction of a second before reasserting itself. But that moment was enough for Steve to realize he had inadvertently touched on something significant. Sarah took a visible breath before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried the controlled emotion of someone who had been trained to deliver difficult information without breaking down. "My husband, First Lieutenant David Henderson, passed away last month, Mr. Harvey. He was killed in a training accident at Fort Benning." The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey froze, his face reflecting shock and immediate regret for having asked the question. The audience collectively inhaled, and the energy in the room transformed instantly from game show entertainment to something far more somber and significant. Sarah continued speaking before anyone could respond, her words coming faster now as if she needed to explain before her composure failed. "David and I applied to be on Family Feud together 6 months ago. We both loved the show and thought it would be fun to compete as a family. We got the call that we were selected 3 months ago, and David was so excited. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would still come and compete, that I would bring his father and I would play the game for both of us. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Harvey stood motionless, processing the information that this young woman standing before him had lost her husband just weeks ago and had still shown up to compete on a game show because her deceased husband had asked her to promise she would. The other family members stood silently supporting Sarah, their own grief visible in their faces, but contained because Sarah needed them to be strong. Steve finally found words, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Captain Henderson, I am so deeply sorry for your loss. I had no idea. You did not have to come here today. We would have completely understood if you had canceled." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I made David a promise, Mr. Harvey. David loved this show. He watched it every night when he was home. When we got selected, he told everyone he knew that he was going to be on Family Feud with his wife and his family." After the accident, after the funeral, after all the official Army notifications and ceremonies, I realized that coming here and competing like David wanted was one of the last things I could do to honor him. So I called your producers and I asked if I could still come and if I could bring David's father in his place. They said yes. So here we are. Steve struggled to maintain his own composure, visibly fighting tears as he looked at this young widow who was demonstrating a form of courage he had rarely witnessed. "How long were you and David married?" Steve asked gently. 3 years, Sarah responded, and her voice finally cracked slightly. "We met at the officer basic course right after we both commissioned. We got married a year later. He was my best friend, Mr. Harvey. He was funny and kind, and he loved serving his country. He was an infantry officer, one of the best according to his soldiers. The training accident, it was just a freak thing, equipment malfunction during a routine exercise. One moment he was fine, and the next he was gone. They told me he died instantly, that he did not suffer. I do not know if that is true or if they just say that to make families feel better, but I choose to believe it because the alternative is unbearable." Steve made a decision in that moment, signaling to the producers to stop the taping. "We need to pause here," Steve said. "This is not something we should rush through for a game show." The producers immediately agreed, and the cameras stopped rolling while Steve sat down on the stage floor and invited Sarah to sit with him. The rest of the Henderson family gathered around, and for the next 20 minutes, with the studio audience sitting quietly and respectfully, Steve had a real conversation with Sarah about her husband, her loss, and why she had chosen to come to the taping. Sarah explained that the month since David's death had been a blur of military protocols, funeral arrangements, condolence visits from David's unit, and the beginning of the devastating process of sorting through a life that had ended far too soon. She talked about how she had been functioning on autopilot, going through the motions of living because that was what was expected, but feeling disconnected from everything, as if she were watching her life happen to someone else. "Coming here today was the first thing I have done since David died that felt like a choice rather than an obligation," Sarah said. "Everything else has been military requirements or family expectations or social conventions about how widows are supposed to behave. But this, competing on Family Feud like David wanted, this felt like something I could do for him, something that would make him happy. I know it probably seems strange to outside observers that I would come on a game show a month after losing my husband. People probably think I should be at home grieving, wearing black, falling apart. But David would not want that. He would want me to live, to laugh, to keep going. So that is what I am trying to do, even though every moment feels like drowning." Steve listened with complete attention, and when Sarah finished speaking, he shared his own experience with loss, talking about people he had loved who had passed away and how grief was not linear, how there was no correct way to mourn, how everyone had to find their own path through the unbearable. Then Steve asked a question that would lead to an even more profound revelation. "Sarah, you said David died last month. Can you tell me exactly when? Was it recent enough that you should not be here, that we should reschedule this for a later time when you have had more opportunity to process your loss?" Sarah looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring hanging from the chain around her neck, and when she looked back up, her eyes were filled with tears she had been holding back. "David died 4 weeks and 2 days ago, Mr. Harvey. But that is not the only loss our family has experienced recently." Sarah's voice became even quieter, and everyone leaned in to hear her. 3 days after David's funeral, after most of the extended family had returned home and things had started to settle into a new terrible normal, I found out I was pregnant. Steve's eyes widened with shock. Sarah continued, her words coming slowly as if each one cost her something to say aloud. "David and I had been trying to have a baby for about 6 months. We wanted to start a family. When I took the test and saw it was positive, my first thought was joy because this was something David wanted so much. My second thought was devastation because David would never meet his child. And my third thought was that at least I would have this piece of him, this living connection to the man I loved. The studio was absolutely silent, everyone hanging on Sarah's words. I went to my first doctor's appointment last week. Sarah continued, her voice beginning to shake. I was 8 weeks along. They did an ultrasound, and there was no heartbeat. I had miscarried. I lost the baby. I lost the only piece of David I had left. So when you ask who I lost last month, Mr. Harvey, the answer is that I lost everything. I lost my husband, and I lost the child we created together. In the space of a month, my entire future disappeared. The family I was building, the life I had planned, it is all gone. The only thing I have left is my promise to David that I would come here and compete on this show that he loved so much. That is why I am here. That is why I am standing on this stage even though part of me wants to crawl into bed and never come out. Steve Harvey sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down his face, unable to formulate a response adequate to what Sarah had just revealed. The audience was crying openly. The camera operators had resumed filming during this conversation because the producers recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary and important. Sarah's family members surrounded her, all of them crying together, united in grief for David and for the grandchild or niece or nephew they had briefly hoped for and would now never meet. Patricia, Sarah's mother, spoke up to provide additional context. My daughter has shown more strength in the past month than most people show in a lifetime, Mr. Harvey. She buried her husband with military honors. She dealt with all the paperwork and logistics of death while dealing with her own grief. She supported David's parents through their loss of their son. She found out she was pregnant and allowed herself one night of hope before the universe took that away too. And through all of it, she has held herself together with duct tape and determination because that is what Army officers do. They mission focus even when their personal lives are falling apart. Steve finally found his voice, though it was heavy with emotion. Captain Henderson, I want you to know that what you have shared here today is going to impact millions of people. Your loss is unimaginable. The fact that you are standing here at all, let alone that you came to honor your husband's wishes, demonstrates the kind of love and commitment that most people only dream of experiencing. I do not even know what to say except that I am honored to know you, and David must have been an extraordinary man to have earned your love. Sarah wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, the military bearing reasserting itself. He was extraordinary, Mr. Harvey, and I need to finish what we started. I need to compete in this game for both of us. I need to do this one thing that David wanted us to do together, even though he cannot be here. Can we please continue? Steve looked at the producers, at the Henderson family, and at Sarah's determined face. If you are certain you want to continue, then we will continue. But I want you to know that there is no pressure here. If at any point this becomes too much, we stop. Your well-being is more important than any game show. Sarah nodded her agreement, and after a brief break to allow everyone to compose themselves, the taping resumed with the understanding that this would not be a typical Family Feud episode. The game proceeded with unusual solemnity, the audience respectful rather than raucous, Steve thoughtful in his commentary rather than playing for laughs. The Henderson family played well, drawing on the teamwork and mutual support that had gotten them through the past month's tragedies. They advanced through the rounds steadily, and it became clear to everyone watching that this family needed to win, not for the money but for the symbolic victory, for the sense that Sarah could complete this mission she had undertaken on behalf of her late husband. The Henderson family reached fast money with a comfortable margin, and Sarah insisted on competing alongside her father-in-law Robert, David's father, so that both sides of David's family would be represented in the final round. Tricia went first and scored 173 points, setting Robert up for an easy win requiring only 27 additional points. When Robert stepped to the podium, Steve paused before beginning the questions. Mr. Henderson, I know that David was your son and that you are carrying your own unbearable grief while also supporting your daughter-in-law. I want you to know that all of us see your strength and your love. Robert nodded, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. David was my only child, Mr. Harvey. He was everything a father could hope for in a son. Losing him has destroyed me and my wife. But Sarah has given us a reason to keep going because she loved our son and she needs us now. This game today, it is not about money or television. It is about honoring David's memory and supporting his widow. Let us finish what David started. The fast money round proceeded, and Robert answered the 5 questions competently, drawing on decades of life experience. When his answers were revealed, he had scored 98 points for a combined total of 271, well over the 200 needed to win. Confetti fell, and the Henderson family embraced, but their celebration was muted, tears mixed with relief that they had accomplished what they had come to do. Steve Harvey approached Sarah and Robert with visible respect. "Captain Henderson, Mr. Henderson, your family has won $20,000 today, and you have honored Lieutenant Henderson's memory in a beautiful way. But I want to do more than just give you the prize money you earned." Steve turned to address the cameras directly. "What we witnessed here today goes beyond entertainment. We watched a young widow, a woman who has lost everything she held dear in the space of a month, stand up and honor a promise she made to her husband. We watched a family come together in the midst of grief to support one another and to celebrate the memory of a good man who died serving his country." Steve continued with increasing passion. "First Lieutenant David Henderson died in service to the United States Army at age 30. His widow, Captain Sarah Henderson, is 29 years old and facing a lifetime without her partner. That is the reality of military service that civilians often do not think about. We ask young men and women to serve. We send them into dangerous situations, whether in combat zones or training environments, and sometimes they do not come home. And when they do not come home, their families bear the cost of that service for the rest of their lives." Steve paused to compose himself before continuing. "My foundation is going to do several things for the Henderson family. First, we are setting up a scholarship in First Lieutenant David Henderson's name to support children of fallen service members pursuing higher education. Second, we are providing funding for grief counseling and mental health support for Captain Henderson and for David's parents, because processing this kind of loss requires professional help. Third, we are connecting Captain Henderson with organizations that support military widows, because she should not have to navigate this journey alone." The audience applauded, but Steve held up his hand to indicate he was not finished. "But here is what I really want to say, and I need everyone watching to hear this clearly. When you see someone functioning normally, going to work, showing up to commitments, smiling and engaging with the world, you have no idea what they might be carrying inside. Captain Henderson has been going to work every day, fulfilling her military duties, presenting a professional appearance, and nobody looking at her would necessarily know that she buried her husband a month ago and lost her baby a week ago. We walk past people every single day who are drowning in grief, but who have learned to hide it because society expects them to function normally. We need to be kinder to each other. We need to check on the people in our lives even when they seem fine. We need to create space for grief and loss instead of expecting people to just get over it and move on." The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. The segment featuring Sarah's revelation about losing both her husband and her pregnancy became one of the most viewed moments in television history, reaching hundreds of millions of people across all platforms and generating intense conversation about military sacrifice, pregnancy loss, and the hidden nature of grief. Veterans organizations shared the episode widely as an illustration of what military families endure. Pregnancy loss support groups cited Sarah's story as helping to break the silence around miscarriage, a loss that is often minimized or ignored despite its profound impact on those who experience it. Mental health advocates used the episode to discuss complicated grief and the importance of seeking professional support when dealing with multiple tragedies in close succession. Thousands of military widows reached out to Sarah directly, sharing their own stories of loss and thanking her for speaking openly about the reality of young widowhood. Many of these women expressed that they had felt isolated in their grief, that civilians often did not know how to support them, and that seeing Sarah speak so honestly about her experience helped them feel less alone. Sarah began connecting with these other widows, forming a support network of women who understood the specific challenges of losing a spouse to military service. This network eventually formalized into a nonprofit organization providing peer support, practical assistance, and advocacy for military widows navigating the complex aftermath of their loss. Sarah found that helping other women going through similar experiences gave her a sense of purpose during a time when her life felt devoid of meaning. The conversation around pregnancy loss also expanded significantly following Sarah's appearance. Many women shared that they had never discussed their own miscarriages publicly because society treated pregnancy loss as a private matter not appropriate for open discussion. Sarah's willingness to include her miscarriage as part of her story, to acknowledge that she had lost not only her husband, but also their child, helped normalize conversations about pregnancy loss and the legitimate grief that accompanies it. Medical professionals noted that the episode generated increased awareness about the emotional impact of miscarriage, and the need for better support systems for women experiencing pregnancy loss. Several hospitals and medical practices reported implementing improved protocols for supporting patients through miscarriage as a direct result of the conversations sparked by Sarah's story. Steve Harvey remained in contact with Sarah, checking in regularly and featuring updates about her advocacy work on his various shows. The scholarship fund established in David Henderson's name raised over $2 million in its first year, providing educational support to children of fallen service members. The fund prioritized children of service members killed in training accidents, a category that often received less attention and support than children of those killed in combat, despite the equal devastation experienced by their families. Steve also used his platform to advocate for improved safety protocols in military training, arguing that service members should not be dying in peacetime training exercises, and that the military had an obligation to minimize preventable training deaths. Sarah continued her Army career, finding that the structure and mission focus of military service helped her maintain functioning during the most difficult period of her life. She was promoted to Major 2 years after David's death and took command of a logistics unit, becoming known as a compassionate leader who understood that her soldiers were whole people with lives and challenges beyond their military duties. She never remarried, though she dated occasionally, finding that no relationship could compare to what she had shared with David. She spoke openly about her decision to remain single, rejecting the societal pressure for young widows to move on and find new partners, arguing that her love for David did not have an expiration date, and that building a meaningful life did not require romantic partnership. 5 years after her Family Feud appearance, Sarah was invited to speak at Arlington National Cemetery during Memorial Day observances. She stood in her Army dress uniform at David's gravesite and spoke to the assembled crowd about the ongoing cost of military service, about the families who continued to grieve years after the flags had been folded and the ceremonies had concluded, about the importance of remembering not just the fallen, but also those they left behind. She spoke about that day on Family Feud when she had revealed her losses to a national audience, explaining that the decision to be honest about her grief had been simultaneously terrifying and liberating. She acknowledged that many people had questioned her choice to appear on a game show so soon after her husband's death, but she maintained that honoring David's wishes had been exactly what she needed at that moment, a concrete action she could take when everything else felt overwhelming and impossible. The memorial service concluded with the traditional playing of taps and the laying of wreaths at graves throughout Arlington. Sarah placed a wreath at David's headstone, and as she stood there in the spring sunshine, she thought about the conversation she had with Steve Harvey 5 years earlier, about the moment when she had made the choice to speak honestly about who she had lost. She thought about how that honesty had opened doors she had not known existed, had connected her with thousands of other grieving military widows, had contributed to important conversations about loss and support and the hidden costs of service. She thought about the baby she had lost, the child who would have been 4 years old now, and she allowed herself the grief she still carried for that unrealized future. And she thought about David, about his laugh and his kindness and the life they had built together in 3 too short years, and she chose once again to believe that he would be proud of who she had become in the aftermath of losing him. This story illustrates the hidden nature of grief and the strength required to function through devastating loss. Sarah Henderson walked onto that Family Feud stage carrying unimaginable pain while maintaining the professional composure expected of military officers. Her willingness to reveal her losses, to acknowledge that she had buried her husband weeks earlier and lost her pregnancy days before, created space for honest conversation about topics often kept private. Her story reminds us that we cannot know what battles the people around us are fighting, that the person standing next to us in line might be holding themselves together through sheer force of will, and that kindness and compassion cost nothing, but can mean everything to someone who is barely surviving their circumstances. For military families who sacrifice in ways most civilians cannot comprehend, for anyone navigating grief while trying to maintain normal functioning, and for all of us who encounter suffering we cannot see, may this story serve as a reminder to lead with empathy, to check on those who seem strong because strength is often a mask for pain, and to honor the courage it takes to keep living when the person who made life meaningful is gone.